July 7th, 1944. RAF Woodhall Spa, Lincolnshire. A 26-year-old pilot climbs out of a P-51 Mustang fighter and walks across the tarmac. His name is Leonard Cheshire. He has just completed his 100th bombing mission over enemy territory. 100 missions. 4 complete tours of operational duty. In Bomber Command, the average life expectancy of a crew was 14 missions. A single tour was 30 operations. Most men who started a tour never finished it. Leonard Cheshire had just finished 4. He had been flying combat missions continuously since June 1940. 4 years, 100 operations, and he was still alive. Here is the statistical reality of what Leonard Cheshire survived. 57,000 aircrew were killed in Bomber Command during the war. That is 46% of everyone who served. Nearly half. Of those who began a tour of 30 operations, only 1 in 4 would complete it without being killed, wounded, or captured. The other 3 would be gone, dead in a burning aircraft over Germany, drowned in the freezing waters of the North Sea, captured after bailing out, or simply listed as missing, their fate never known. This was not a job with bad odds. This was a job where the odds said you would almost certainly die. And Leonard Cheshire did it 4 times. Let me show you the mathematics of what Cheshire accomplished. If your chance of surviving 1 tour was roughly 25%, then surviving 2 tours meant beating 25% odds twice. That is a 6% chance. 3 tours, 1.5%. 4 tours, 0.4%, less than 1 in 200. And Cheshire did not fly easy missions. He flew to Berlin, to Cologne, to Munich, to the most heavily defended targets in Nazi Germany. He flew when he did not have to fly. He flew when regulations said he should be grounded. He flew because he believed it was his duty. And somehow, against all mathematical probability, he survived. What made Leonard Cheshire different from the 57,000 who died? Part of it was skill. He was a meticulous pilot who learned every system of every aircraft he flew. Part of it was luck. Random chance determined whether a flak shell exploded 10 feet to your left or 10 feet to your right. But there was something else. Cheshire possessed an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under fire. His crews noticed it. Other pilots noticed it. In situations that would have paralyzed most men with fear, Leonard Cheshire became more focused, more precise, more deadly effective. He genuinely believed that if he knew his aircraft perfectly, he could survive anything. For 4 years, he proved himself right. To understand what Cheshire endured, you need to understand what Bomber Command asked of its men. In 1940 and 1941, they flew obsolete aircraft with primitive navigation equipment into the heart of Nazi Germany. The Armstrong Whitworth Whitley, Cheshire's first bomber, cruised at barely 180 miles per hour. Its ceiling was 17,000 feet. German night fighters could outclimb it, outrun it, and outgun it. The crews navigated by dead reckoning, trying to find blacked-out cities in total darkness while anti-aircraft batteries threw up walls of exploding steel. On a good night, half the bombs fell within 5 miles of the target. On bad nights, crews bombed the wrong city entirely. The Whitley was a miserable aircraft to fly. The fuselage was so drafty that rain dripped through the perspex canopy onto the crew. The heating system barely worked. At 17,000 feet in winter, the temperature inside the aircraft could drop to minus 30 degrees. Frostbite was common. The aircraft vibrated constantly, making precision, flying exhausting. And yet this was the machine that Bomber Command sent against the Third Reich night after night. Cheshire learned to fly the Whitley in all conditions, in all weather, against all odds. He learned its every weakness and how to compensate. That knowledge would save his life more than once. The Royal Air Force had a brutal policy for men who could not continue flying. They called it lack of moral fiber, LMF. The message was clear. You fly until you complete your tour, or you fly until you die. There was no honorable way out. A man classified as LMF would lose his flying badge. Officers lost their commissions. Enlisted men were reduced to the lowest rank and assigned to clean latrines while their former colleagues continued to fly and die. The stigma was crushing and permanent. Leonard Cheshire supported this policy. He believed it was necessary. Years later, he would write with characteristic honesty, quote, "I was ruthless with LMF. I had to be. We were airmen, not psychiatrists." End quote. Remember those words. They will matter later. Cheshire arrived at 102 Squadron in June 1940, fresh from training and assigned as second pilot to Flight Lieutenant Hugh Long. Long was a tall New Zealander everyone called Lofty, and he was exactly the mentor a young pilot needed. Lofty Long was meticulous and professional. He knew his Whitley bomber inside and out, every switch, every gauge, every emergency procedure. He made Cheshire learn them all until he could find them blindfolded in a burning aircraft. But Long taught Cheshire something more important than technical skills. He knew every man who worked on his aircraft, from ground crew to armourers, and he understood their problems and concerns. Cheshire watched. Cheshire learned. On November 12, 1940, Cheshire flew a mission to bomb a synthetic oil plant near Cologne. He was still a pilot officer, the most junior commissioned rank. Weather obscured the primary target, so he diverted to the railway yards at Cologne. The approach seemed quiet at first. Then 2 anti-aircraft shells exploded almost simultaneously, one above the cockpit and one beneath the port wing. The flash from the first shell blinded Cheshire completely. The second tore a massive hole in the fuselage and ignited one of the aircraft's flares. The Whitley went into a steep dive. Unable to see, Cheshire fought the controls by instinct alone and pulled out at 5,000 feet. His vision slowly returning. The crew extinguished the fire. The aircraft was crippled but flyable. Any reasonable pilot would have turned for home immediately. Leonard Cheshire was not a reasonable pilot. He assessed the damage. Both engines were running. The aircraft could fly, and he had not yet bombed his target. So he turned back toward Cologne. He flew over the marshalling yards with flak batteries concentrating their fire on his burning, crippled bomber. He found his aiming point. He dropped his bombs. Then, and only then, he turned for home. The flight back took hours, nursing the dying aircraft across the North Sea. For this action, Cheshire was awarded the Distinguished Service Order. He was 23 years old and still a pilot officer. The DSO was normally reserved for senior officers. His first tour ended in January 1941. He had completed 30 operations. By any standard, he had done enough. He had beaten the odds. He could have accepted a training position and spent the rest of the war in relative safety. Instead, he immediately volunteered for a second tour. He was posted to 35 Squadron, converting to the new Handley Page Halifax, the RAF's first 4-engine heavy bomber. The Halifax could carry more bombs, fly higher, and defend itself better than the Whitley. It was also more complex to fly. Cheshire threw himself into learning every system. During his time with 35 Squadron, he flew 7 raids on Berlin, the most heavily defended target in Europe. Berlin was protected by over 1,000 anti-aircraft guns and hundreds of searchlights. Night fighters prowled constantly, guided by radar to the bomber streams. Flak was so thick that pilots described flying through solid walls of fire. Every raid on Berlin was a death sentence for some crews. Cheshire flew 7 of them. He was promoted to squadron leader and awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. When his second tour ended in early 1942, he had completed roughly 50 operations. He had now survived twice as long as the average bomber pilot. The statistical probability of being alive at this point was approximately 6%. He volunteered for a third tour. By summer 1942, Cheshire was one of the most experienced bomber pilots in the RAF. In August, he was promoted to wing commander and given command of 76 Squadron at Linton-on-Ouse. The squadron was broken. Heavy losses had shattered morale. The crews had lost faith in their aircraft, their tactics, and their leadership. Cheshire's job was to rebuild them into an effective fighting unit. This required more than flying skill. He needed to inspire men who had every reason to believe they would not survive. He approached the problem with characteristic thoroughness, starting with the aircraft themselves and the modifications that might save lives. The Halifax Mark II had serious problems. It could not fly as high as the Lancaster, which meant more exposure to flak and night fighters. Cheshire ordered modifications. He had exhaust shrouds removed. He stripped weight from the gun turrets. Every unnecessary ounce came off. The changes allowed the aircraft to fly higher and faster. Losses began to fall. But the technical changes were only part of the solution. Cheshire also flew operations himself, far more than regulations allowed. As commanding officer, he was limited to one mission per month. He found reasons to fly several times per month. He always chose the most dangerous targets. He never flew milk runs to France. Cheshire had no regular crew of his own. Instead, he flew with different crews, sometimes as second pilot to give confidence to novices, sometimes taking the controls to demonstrate evasion techniques. When a new crew arrived at the squadron, Cheshire would fly their first operation with them. He showed them how to corkscrew away from night fighters, how to evade the worst of the flak, how to survive. Many did not come back from subsequent missions, but more came back than had before Cheshire arrived. The ground crews began calling themselves the Cheshire Cats. They were proud of the name, and they were proud to work for a commander who knew every one of them by name. There was something else Cheshire did that set him apart from other commanders. He learned the name of every person on the base, not just aircrew, ground crew, armourers, mechanics, cooks, everyone. He learned their names, their backgrounds, their concerns. When he walked through the hangars, he greeted men by name and asked about their families. This was not manipulation. Cheshire genuinely believed that everyone who supported the bombers was part of the same team facing the same enemy. He had learned this from Lofty Long, and now he made it the foundation of his command. His third tour ended in early 1943. He had completed approximately 70 operations. The statistical probability of surviving this long was approaching 1%. In March 1943, Leonard Cheshire was promoted to Group Captain. At 25, he became the youngest Group Captain in the history of the Royal Air Force. It should have been the crowning achievement of his war. Instead, it nearly destroyed him. Promotion to Group Captain meant he was taken off operations and assigned to command Marston Moor, a training unit. It was important work. It was safe work, and Cheshire hated every minute of it. For 7 months, he sat at a desk while his war went on without him. He trained pilots and sent them to squadrons where many would die. He watched operational reports come in, knowing he was no longer part of it. Air Vice Marshal Ralph Cochrane commanded No. 5 Group, which included 617 Squadron, the famous Dambusters who had destroyed the Ruhr dams in May 1943. But 617 was in trouble. Guy Gibson had been taken off operations. His replacement had been killed in a disastrous low-level raid. Of the 19 pilots who flew the dams raid, only 5 were still alive. The squadron needed a new commander. Cochrane had someone in mind. He asked Cheshire if he would take the job. There was one condition. To command a squadron, Cheshire would have to give up his rank of Group Captain. He would demote himself by 2 full ranks, returning to Wing Commander. Cheshire accepted without hesitation. On November 11th, 1943, Wing Commander Leonard Cheshire arrived at 617 Squadron. The Dambusters regarded him with suspicion. They were an elite unit that had developed extraordinary skills in low-level formation, flying at night, skills no other squadron possessed. They had earned their pride. Now this outsider was coming to lead them. Cheshire understood he would have to earn their respect the only way he knew how: by flying with them into the most dangerous situations. The squadron had been given a critical mission. In northern France, the Germans were building massive underground bunkers for a weapon called the V3, a supergun capable of firing shells into London at 1 round per minute. The V3 guns were buried at Mimoyeques in the Pas-de-Calais, protected by 50 feet of reinforced concrete. Conventional bombing could not touch them. Barnes Wallis, the genius who designed the bouncing bomb, had created a new weapon called the Tallboy. Weighing 12,000 pounds, it was designed to penetrate deep into the earth and create a localized earthquake. But the Tallboy had to be dropped with extraordinary precision. Wallis calculated that one bomb in 15 needed to land within 12 meters of the target. When Cheshire raised concerns about achieving such accuracy, Wallis replied bluntly, quote, "If you are going to scatter my bombs all over northern France, what is the point of my building them?" End quote. Cheshire had an idea. The Pathfinder force marked targets from high altitude, but their accuracy was insufficient for small targets like V-weapon sites. What if, instead of dropping markers from 15,000 feet, a single aircraft dove to rooftop height and placed a marker directly on the target? The idea was considered suicidal by most senior officers, but Cheshire intended to prove it could work. His opportunity came on February 8, 1944. The target was the Gnome Aeron aero-engine factory at Limoges in France. The factory was surrounded by French workers' homes. Conventional bombing would kill hundreds of civilians, but the factory was lightly defended. It was perfect for an experiment. On the night of February 8th, Cheshire led 12 Lancasters to Limoges. Before any bombs fell, he did something extraordinary. He dove his Lancaster to rooftop height and made 3 low passes directly over the factory. He was warning the workers, "Get out! Bombs are coming." Then, on his 4th pass, at just 50 feet above the ground, he dropped his marker flares directly onto the factory roof. The workers had fled. The Lancasters bombed the marker with unprecedented accuracy. Only one bomb missed. The factory was destroyed. French civilian casualties were almost zero. Cheshire had revolutionized target marking, but Limoges was lightly defended. The real test would be against a heavily defended German city. The Limoges raid demonstrated something important about Leonard Cheshire. He was not simply a brave pilot willing to take risks, he was a thinking pilot who cared about the consequences of his actions. By warning the French workers, he accepted additional danger for himself. 3 low passes over a factory gave any defender time to react, time to shoot. But Cheshire believed that if precision bombing could destroy military targets without killing civilians, then it was worth the extra risk. This philosophy would guide 617 Squadron for the rest of the war. The success at Limoges proved the concept, but Cheshire knew he needed faster aircraft for heavily defended targets. A Lancaster at 50 feet over Munich would be suicide. He needed something that could dive in fast, mark the target, and escape before the defenses could react. The de Havilland Mosquito was the obvious choice. Made of wood, it was one of the fastest aircraft in the sky. It could outrun most German fighters and outmaneuver flak batteries. But getting Mosquitoes assigned to 617 Squadron would require proving the technique against a major target. If you want to see how Leonard Cheshire proved that low-level marking could work against the most heavily defended targets in Germany, hit that like button. It really does help us share more forgotten stories from World War II. Subscribe if you have not already. Back to Cheshire. Arthur Harris, Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command, was skeptical about low-level marking. He believed no pilot could survive diving to 50 feet over a German city. Cheshire wanted faster Mosquito aircraft for the marking runs. Harris issued a challenge. Quote, "Mark me Munich and I will give you the Mosquitoes. Miss Munich and you will lose the Mosquitoes." End quote. Munich was one of the most heavily defended cities in the Reich. On the night of April 24, 1944, 4617 Squadron Mosquitoes took off to mark Munich. The approach took them deep into Nazi Germany. As they neared the city, the sky erupted with searchlights and flak. A lesser pilot would have marked from altitude and turned for home. Cheshire dove. He pushed his Mosquito through the flak, past the searchlights, down until the rooftops of Munich filled his windscreen. At less than 1,000 feet, he released his markers directly onto the railway yards. Then he did something remarkable. For 12 full minutes, he remained over the target in slow figure eights, so the main force could see exactly where to bomb. 12 minutes with every gun in Munich trying to kill him, weaving and turning at low altitude while anti-aircraft shells burst all around him. Any one of those shells could have ended his life instantly. But Cheshire believed his job was not finished until the bombers had their aiming point clearly visible. After 12 minutes, he turned for home. All 4 Mosquitoes returned safely. The railway yards were destroyed. Harris kept his word. Cheshire got his Mosquitoes. The low-level marking technique that everyone said was impossible had just been proven against one of the most heavily defended cities in Germany. And 617 Squadron was just getting started. The Munich raid changed everything. Before that night, Pathfinder Force marked all major targets from high altitude. After Munich, low-level marking became the standard for precision attacks against small targets. Cheshire had not just proven a technique. He had invented a new kind of warfare. The accuracy of 617 Squadron attacks was unprecedented. At Meilly-le-Camp, they destroyed a German military camp with minimal French civilian casualties. At factory after factory, they hit the target buildings while leaving surrounding neighborhoods intact. Precision bombing was becoming a reality. The raids came in rapid succession: Toulouse, Clermont-Ferrand, Brunswick. Each time, Cheshire dove through the flak to mark the target. Each time, he survived. His reputation grew among the bomber crews. They called him a wizard. They said he was charmed. Some believed he was simply too good for the Germans to kill. The truth was simpler. Cheshire prepared obsessively for every mission. He knew exactly where the guns were, exactly how fast he needed to fly, exactly when to turn. He left nothing to chance, and he was very, very lucky. June 6, 1944. D-Day. While Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, 617 Squadron flew Operation Taxable, a deception mission designed to make the Germans believe an invasion fleet was approaching Cap d'Antifer, 20 miles north of the real beaches. 16 Lancasters flew precise patterns over the English Channel, dropping aluminum strips at exact intervals. On German radar, it appeared that ships were crossing toward France. The deception held for 8 hours, drawing German attention away from the actual invasion. Cheshire later said this mission may have saved more lives than any other the squadron flew. But there was no time to rest. German reinforcements were moving toward Normandy. The deception required extraordinary precision flying. Each Lancaster had to maintain exact speed and heading while dropping window chaff at precise 5-second intervals. Too fast, and the fake fleet would appear to be racing across the channel at impossible speed. Too slow, and the illusion would collapse. For 8 hours, through the darkness, the crews flew their patterns while the real invasion unfolded to the south. They could see the flashes of naval gunfire on the horizon. They knew that thousands of men were fighting and dying on the beaches, and they kept flying their patterns, maintaining the deception that kept German reserves pointed in the wrong direction. 2 nights after D-Day, 617 Squadron conducted the first operational use of the Tallboy bomb. The target was the Saumur railway tunnel, the route German armor would use to reach Normandy. A panzer division was moving toward the battlefield. The tunnel had to be destroyed. Cheshire dove to 500 feet to place markers at the tunnel entrance. Then the Lancasters came, each carrying a single Tallboy. One bomb hit the hillside directly above the tunnel mouth, bringing down tons of earth and rock. Others severed the tracks. The tunnel was destroyed. The Panzer Division never reached Normandy by rail. Barnes-Wallace's earthquake bomb had proven itself. 6 days later, the squadron attacked the E-boat pens at Le Havre. These concrete bunkers with roofs 3 meters thick sheltered 15 German torpedo boats threatening Allied supply ships. Conventional bombs could not penetrate the concrete. Tallboys could. The squadron dropped their bombs with devastating accuracy. One Tallboy penetrated the roof and exploded inside. But Cheshire added something unexpected. He ordered some aircraft to drop their Tallboys into the harbor waters. The explosions were so powerful that 10 German ships were blown completely out of the water and onto the quayside. Cheshire's comment was characteristic of his dry humor. Quote, Barnes-Wallis had a big bomb. End quote. Throughout June and July, 617 Squadron attacked target after target. V-1 launch sites, V-2 storage bunkers, the massive concrete structures of the German Vengeance weapon program. Each attack required Cheshire to dive through murderous anti-aircraft fire, place his markers with precision, and survive long enough to see the bombs fall accurately. His 98th mission. His 99th. On June 25th, he attacked a V-1 bunker at Siracourt. His Mosquitoes had been claimed by another squadron, so he flew a Mustang fighter instead. He had never flown a single-seat aircraft on operations. He had no navigator. He plotted his own course and took off alone. Cheshire caught up with the Lancasters, found the target, marked it perfectly, and watched 3 Tallboys destroy the bunker. He flew home alone in the Mustang, navigating by memory over occupied France. 11 days later, on July 6th, came the mission he had been waiting for since taking command. The target was Mimoyekes, the V-3 supergun site that 617 Squadron had been created to destroy. Cheshire flew his Mustang through intense anti-aircraft fire and marked the target. The Lancasters dropped their Tallboys. The underground chambers collapsed. The V-3 guns would never fire a single shot. London was saved from a weapon that could have killed thousands. On July 7th, 617 Squadron attacked a limestone cave at Saint-Lô-d'Esserent, where the Germans stored V-1 and V-2 rockets. Cheshire flew as target marker in his Mustang. It was his 100th operation. 100 times he had climbed into an aircraft knowing he might not return. 100 times he had faced the flak and the fighters and the dark. The Tallboys struck true. The cave partially collapsed. The tunnels were blocked. The next day, Air Vice Marshal Cochrane called Cheshire to his office. He was being taken off operations. At the same time, Cochrane stood down Shannon, Monroe, and McCarthy, the last surviving pilots from the Dams raid. The old guard of 617 Squadron was finished. On September 8, 1944, the London Gazette announced that Wing Commander Leonard Cheshire had been awarded the Victoria Cross. The citation described raid after raid, act of courage after act of courage. What made Cheshire's VC unique was its conclusion. The award was given not for any single action, but for 4 years of continuous fighting against, quote, the bitterest opposition, end quote, during which he maintained, quote, a record of outstanding personal achievement, placing himself invariably in the forefront of battle, end quote. It was the only Victoria Cross in aviation history awarded for sustained courage rather than a single moment of heroism. At Buckingham Palace, both Cheshire and Warrant Officer Norman Jackson were to receive the Victoria Cross that day. The ceremony would be a rare occasion when 2 VCs were awarded simultaneously. Cheshire had a request for the King. He asked George VI to award Jackson's medal first. Why would a man who had flown 100 missions ask to go second? Because, as Cheshire explained, Jackson had really stuck his neck out. Jackson had climbed onto the wing of a burning Lancaster at 15,000 feet to fight a fire with a handheld extinguisher. He had fallen off, been captured, and spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. Cheshire believed Jackson deserved the honor of going first. The King was reportedly surprised by the request, but granted it. Norman Jackson received his Victoria Cross first. Then Cheshire stepped forward. The ceremony was brief, as all such ceremonies are. A few words, a handshake, and the medal pinned to his chest. But for those who knew Leonard Cheshire, the request to let Jackson go first said everything about the man. He had flown 100 operations. He had revolutionized bombing tactics. He had destroyed the V-3 guns that threatened London. And he still did not think of himself as exceptional. That humility was perhaps his greatest quality. The war was not quite over for Cheshire. In July 1945, working a desk job in Washington, he received extraordinary news. He had been selected by Winston Churchill to witness a secret weapon being used against Japan. Cheshire traveled to Tinian Island in the Pacific. He was told about the Manhattan Project and the creation of the atomic bomb. On August 6th, the first bomb destroyed Hiroshima. 3 days later, Cheshire was aboard a B-29 called Big Stink, flying toward Japan for the second attack. The primary target was Kokura, but clouds obscured the city. The mission diverted to Nagasaki. Cheshire watched from 50 miles away as the bomb fell. He later described it as a vast fireball becoming dense smoke, half a mile in diameter, rocketing upward at 20,000 feet per minute. The most decorated bomber pilot in Britain watched a single weapon do more destruction than Bomber Command had done in a month. On his return to Britain, Cheshire made a radio broadcast about what he had witnessed. His words were carefully chosen. Quote, "We are faced either with the end of this country or the end of war. Ending war and making a better future is not a responsibility that belongs exclusively to the government. Each one of us must play our part." End quote. The man who had spent 4 years perfecting the art of destruction was now thinking about how to build peace. Something fundamental had shifted inside him. The question was what he would do about it. The experience of Nagasaki haunted Cheshire for the rest of his life. He had seen cities burn before. He had dropped bombs that killed thousands. But there was something different about watching a single weapon erase an entire city in a flash of light. Many assumed this was what changed him. Cheshire always said it was the war as a whole, not just the atomic bomb. But whatever the cause, he could not simply return to normal life. He had seen too much. He had done too much. He needed to find a way to give meaning to what he had experienced. The war ended. Leonard Cheshire left the RAF. He was 31 years old, a Victoria Cross holder, a man who could have had any career he wanted. He chose to disappear. He bought a country house called Lecourt in Hampshire and tried to establish a community for ex-servicemen struggling with civilian life. The venture failed. By spring 1948, Cheshire was alone in a crumbling house with no money and no purpose. Then the telephone rang. A hospital was calling about Arthur Dykes, a former member of his community who was dying of cancer with nowhere to go. They asked if Cheshire could take him in. Cheshire said yes. Arthur Dykes was a devout Roman Catholic. As Cheshire nursed him through his final months, they talked about faith, about meaning, about what matters when everything else is stripped away. Cheshire had considered himself a lapsed Christian. Watching Arthur Dykes face death with serenity and grace changed something deep inside him. On Christmas Eve, 1948, Leonard Cheshire was received into the Roman Catholic Church. He sat by Arthur Dykes' bed as the man died peacefully. Then other people began arriving at Lecourt. Other sick people, other dying people, other people with nowhere else to go. Cheshire took them all in. He had found his new mission. By summer 1949, Lecourt had 24 residents. The National Health Service was struggling to cope with demand. Disabled people were at the very bottom of the priority list. Hospitals were discharging patients who had nowhere to go. Word spread that there was a place in Hampshire where a Victoria Cross holder was taking in anyone who needed help. Referrals came from hospitals across the country. Local communities rallied to support the endeavour. Cheshire had stumbled into something far bigger than he had imagined. He was building a movement. The growth was organic and unexpected. Cheshire had no master plan. He simply said yes to people who needed help and figured out how to make it work. In 1951, the operation was formalised as the Leonard Cheshire Trust. By 1955, there were 5 homes in Britain and the first overseas home opened in Mumbai, India. The charity grew because it met a genuine need that no one else was addressing. Disabled people who had been forgotten by society found dignity and care in Cheshire homes. The ruthless wartime commander had become a servant of the most vulnerable. Remember what Cheshire wrote about the war? "I was ruthless with LMF. I had to be. We were airmen, not psychiatrists." The same man who had sent frightened aircrew off his squadron without sympathy was now spending his days caring for the sick and dying. The same man who believed fear was a weakness to be stamped out was now nursing people through their darkest hours with infinite patience and compassion. Some thought the atomic bomb had changed him. Cheshire denied it. He said the war as a whole had changed him, not any single moment. Whatever the cause, the transformation was complete. By 1955, there were 6 Cheshire homes in Britain. The first overseas home opened in Mumbai. By 1970, there were Cheshire homes in 20 countries. Leonard Cheshire had built something that would outlast him. He married Sue Ryder in 1959. She was also a Roman Catholic convert dedicated to humanitarian work. Together they founded the Ryder Cheshire Foundation. They had 2 children and lived in the village of Cavendish, Suffolk. Cheshire spent his remaining years travelling the world, visiting homes on every continent, advocating for disabled people. In 1981, Queen Elizabeth appointed him to the Order of Merit. In 1991, he was elevated to Baron Cheshire of Woodhull, named for the RAF base where he had led 617 Squadron. Leonard Cheshire died on July 31, 1992. He was 74. His final illness was motor neurone disease, a cruel fate for a man who had always valued action and capability. He faced it as he had faced everything, with courage and without complaint. In his final months, he wrote that the disease might be a blessing in disguise, giving him new insights into how disability affects life. Cardinal Hume called him a truly outstanding human being who was exceptionally brave and compassionate. Today, Leonard Cheshire, the charity operates in over 50 countries. It is one of the top 30 charities in Britain. The Roman Catholic Diocese of East Anglia has opened a cause for his beatification. 102 operations, 4 tours, the youngest group captain in RAF history, the only Victoria Cross awarded for sustained courage, the observer who watched the atomic age begin, the founder of a global charity, the man considered for sainthood. Leonard Cheshire lived several lifetimes in 74 years. But the most remarkable thing about him is not what he achieved. It is how completely he was willing to change. At 25, he believed fear was weakness and compassion a luxury. At 35, he was nursing dying strangers with his own hands. The pilot who flew 100 missions became the man who cared for the weakest members of society. That transformation is his true legacy.